Have you ever asked yourself the question, why am I here? For the fried chicken. Have you ever asked yourself that question? I mean, really in a big way, that soul-deep human question. What's my purpose in life? Why do I exist? Why am I here? And I think there are questions that all of us carry around as human beings, questions that all of us wrestle with. And in the next couple of weeks, we're going to be digging into some of those and looking at how the Bible and the life and teaching of Jesus can shed some light on them. They're questions like, why am I here? Can I know God? Why do bad things happen to good people? Where's the world headed? And what happens when we die? And we're calling this series 5 Big Questions. And I'm guessing that all of us at some point in our lives has wrestled with questions like this. And we're starting with this question of why am I here? Because it's really a question that gets at the heart of the human experience. And I think that at some point, all of us desire meaning in our lives. We're all looking for something beyond the daily grind. Why am I here? Now, I think about Henry David Thoreau. Do you remember him from high school literature class, Henry David Thoreau? And, he was in big city Boston and felt like he needed to get a little bit of perspective and kind of think about life. Why am I here? And so he goes out to Walden Pond outside of Boston, not that far from civilization, but just far enough, and he lives in this little cabin. And, his question is kind of, what now, right? Go out there and think about life. And you can go to Walden Pond today. It's still there. I've swum in it. And Thoreau writes this when he's out there at Walden Pond. He says, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." And maybe that's what he was experiencing. So he went out to Walden Pond to kind of step back from the usual order of life and just truly be. And I think his question was the basic one. Why am I here? Now, at the end of the book of Joshua, the Israelites are in a moment that's a little bit like Thoreau, and God led the people of Israel out of Egypt and through the desert and to the promised land, and they have struggled, and they have faced setbacks and challenges, and in the end, they did it. They won. They conquered the promised land. They fought back the hostile tribes. They overcame the giants. They arrived. Now what? And so Joshua, who was Moses' right-hand man, this young guy who had the courage to scout out the promised land and serve as a leader of the people when Moses died, Joshua gives them some advice. And he tells them that if they're going to live a life with purpose, the good and abundant life, then they need to keep the commandments of the law of Moses. They need to love the Lord your God, walk in his ways, hold fast to him, serve him with all your heart and all your soul. And maybe we could sum up Joshua's words like this. They're going to need to seek, know, and love God. Do all these things, and you'll be on the path toward a life that matters. Now, here's some context for what's going on. The book of Joshua tells the story of how the Israelites conquer the land that God promised to their ancestor Abraham back in Genesis 12. And that promised land is beyond the Jordan. It's it's around the Jordan River. And most of the tribes were allotted land on the west side of the Jordan, but there were 3 tribes, a couple of them that were on the east side. So Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. And they're called the half-tribe of Manasseh because they were divided in half by the Jordan, so half-tribe. And so they were on the west side. The rest of the tribes were on the east side. And when they got their land on the west side, Joshua said, now look, you can't just put your feet up. We all have to cross over together. You can't abandon your brothers. You're going to have to come over and help everyone with the Israelites conquer the promised land. And they did. And so earlier in the book of Joshua, Joshua had given the tribes marching orders. He'd given them instructions on how to achieve their objectives. So Jericho, march around it 7 times, right, below the horns. Make the soldiers of Ai think that you're retreating, then attack their city from the side. Set up these cities of refuge. But the instructions that Joshua gives here at the very end of the book are a little bit different. These are not concrete things that they're going to go and do. These instructions are on how to live. So they achieved what they set out to do. Now what? Now, if you're following along in chapter 22, in verse 4, it says, Now that the Lord your God has given your brothers rest as he promised, return to your homes in the land that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you on the other side of the Jordan. So that first part is really important there. He says, return to your homes. Right? That's the key. They're to go home, go and live. He's saying, go back to your everyday lives. That thing, the conquest, that's over. Now go back and live. And the thing about the conquest of the promised land is that for a long time, the hopes and dreams of the Israelites would have been involved in this big thing, this momentous thing, this thing that gave meaning and urgency to their lives. It was the conquest of the promised land. And now it's over. And Joshua says, go home. They had achieved and received all that their hearts had longed for. Now what? And you see, there are going to be moments in our lives that are about achieving something. We're going to be there just like the Israelites. There's going to be moments in our lives that are about achieving something, when there's some goal that is right in front of our eyes, something that gives us purpose, completing school or finding a job or doing service or starting a business. And they're going to be things that we want to obtain for ourselves or for our families, that first home or that car, whatever it is. And then it's done. It's accomplished, or we have it. And maybe for a little while we feel good, but from there's going to be this moment where we'll wake up and we'll say to ourselves, now what? You finish school, now what? You marry the girl or the guy, now what? You land that job that you've always wanted, now what? And maybe for some people this question never really comes up, because when they ask now what, they just immediately say, well, more. But the question of now what really gets us to a deep place, because it's not just about the next thing, it's really a purpose question. It's really a question about what gives meaning to our lives. When we ask, now what, I think what we're really asking is, why am I here? Right? It's the question of what am I living for? What makes my life count for something? Why am I here? Have you ever asked yourself this question? I have. It's the kind of question that rises up in us sometimes when we go out on a clear night and we look up in the sky and we just think, wow, we're pretty small. It's the kind of thing where we look up at the grandeur of the universe and we just want to shout, I'm significant, even though we feel like a dreaming dust speck. But part of what Joshua is saying is that the people of God have been seeking to achieve something, seeking to obtain something for a very long time. And now it's time to go home and live. And they're moving into another chapter in their lives. And here's what they've got to do. They got to keep the commandments, love God, walk in his ways, hold fast to God, serve him with all their hearts and souls. In other words, seek God, know God, love God. Notice something. Joshua's not telling them how to be good. He's not telling them how to get to heaven. He's not telling them what they need to do to earn God's favor, as if such a thing were possible. Joshua's telling them what they need to do to live and to live well. And you see, there are parts of the Bible that give instruction on how we ought to act, on how we ought to get to heaven. That's in there. But a whole lot of the Bible, including this part, is really about how to live the authentic human life. That's where the Israelites are at. And so the people's old external mission and goals aren't going to have the same resonance for them anymore. They've conquered the promised land, and they've got to go home and work and raise their families. They're going to go through good times and bad times and the times in between that can seem kind of dull. And they'll live a life. They will live a life that matters. Or how will they do it? How will they live a life that counts for something in those circumstances? And Joshua tells them, seek God, know God, love God. Now, the book of Joshua is history, but there's also a long tradition in the church of reading Joshua as a spiritual quest. So just think about this. Joshua as a spiritual quest. Each of us is called to the promised land of God's kingdom. And there are mountains to climb. And there are strongholds that have to be challenged. And there are giants. But be strong and courageous. The Lord is with you. That is the message of Joshua. And so when I read chapter 22, I see something kind of like that. It's about this spiritual quest for the authentic human life. Why am I here? To seek God, know God, love God. And this means making God the center of our identity and our hopes, our work, our play, our thoughts, our entertainment. All of those things can become expressions of seeking God, knowing God, and loving God. And I know that that is a very churchy kind of thing to say, to make God the center. But think about it. There are all kinds of options out there. Other things that we can try to make the center of our lives. You don't have to think very hard to know what I'm talking about. There's family or comfort or work or accomplishment, and those are good things. But in the end, none of them endures, and nothing else is worthy of our lives but God. You see, we can achieve a lot and still be left asking why we're here. We can earn a lot and still wake up in the morning and say, why am I here? And I'm convinced that we got to be grounded in something that's bigger than ourselves, and in the end, only God is big enough. There's something about the human spirit that longs for eternity, that hungers for depth, that seeks meaning beyond ourselves. And I don't think we can find that anywhere else but God. When you look at the scriptures, you see people who are living with that kind of depth. And the Bible is a really interesting book because the people in the Bible, they are not perfect people. And in fact, sometimes they are deeply flawed people. But one thing that you do see people doing is living with depth. They're people who seek God with their whole hearts, minds, and strength. Nowhere do we see that depth more than in Jesus. He embodies life with depth, and you look at Jesus' life and you see something complete. Jesus was someone who knew how to live. He had courage in the face of the powers that be. He showed worth to those on the margins. He was grounded and non-anxious when everyone around him was running scared. Jesus was someone who had a vibrant life of prayer, a spiritual charisma that drew others to him. But he didn't go around doing religious stuff. He wasn't a priest in the temple. Jesus was simply alive to the presence of his Father, and he wanted to share that life with others. His life had an invitational air. Children were attracted to him. When some guys started walking behind him one day to kind of see what he was about, he turns around and says, "What are you looking for?" And then he casts an invitation to them. He says, "Come and see." Jesus is a living, breathing invitation to a way of life that's grounded in God. Jesus shows us what it looks like to seek God, know God, and love God. To seek God is to search for God. It's to ask who God is, what God desires. It's to want to do the will of God. The prophet Isaiah said, "Seek the Lord while he may be found." It's the quest. It's the longing for something more. It's the desire to know more about God. And I'll tell you that my whole life has been about seeking God. I was raised in a Christian home. I grew up surrounded by faith. But for me, it's always been faith-seeking understanding. The questions are really what drive me. Learning more drives me. Coming to know God more drives me. And seeking God for me is about studying the scriptures. It's about prayer. But it's also about asking questions. Because when we ask questions, that means that we're open to something new. And I'm convinced that having faith means being open to growing and asking questions. Now, one of the people that you really see seeking God in the scriptures is King David. The man made a mess of his life at various points. I mean, he got called onto the carpet for adultery and murder. He wanted to build the temple to God, but God told him that he couldn't because he had taken the path of warrior, that he had too much blood on his hands. But nevertheless, the Bible calls David a man after God's own heart. And it's not because David was a sinless individual. It's because David sought God with his whole heart. We're also called to know God. That's what Joshua was getting at when he said to walk in God's ways and hold fast to him. Deep down, that's what we're made for. And that's my desire for each one of us, that we have that kind of personal encounter with God. It's like St. Augustine put it, our hearts are restless until they rest in God. And we'll never get to the end of knowing God. We don't get to the end. One time I was up in the mountains of Peru, sitting around outside of the church, waiting for something or other to start, and some kids were there kind of messing around from the village, and one of them comes up to me, sitting there outside this church in Peru, one of them comes up and says, "Do you speak English?" Right? And I said, I mean, he asked me in Spanish, right? Do you speak English? And I'm like, yeah. And then he says, do you speak all of English? Do you know all of English? And I don't know quite what he meant. And I said, well, I don't know all of English, but I know English. We can't know all of God, but we can know God. And we can enter into a loving relationship with him. Now, no one else can do this for you. It doesn't matter if your grandma knows God. You've got to know God for yourself. When Martin Luther King Jr. was a young Baptist pastor in Montgomery, Alabama, his preaching and activism got under the skin of some of the powers that be. You know, his message of equal rights, his message of the worth of every individual, regardless of skin color, that did not fly in the Jim Crow South at the time. And he got this middle-of-the-night phone call where someone threatened him and said that if he didn't get out of town within 3 days, they'd kill him. And so there he is, Martin Luther King Jr., sitting at the kitchen table after receiving a phone call like this shocking threat to himself and to his family. And he says about that moment, he writes about it, he says, I had to know God for myself. I bowed my head over that cup of coffee. I will never forget it. I prayed, and I discovered then that religion had to become real to me. I could hear a voice saying, stand up for peace, stand up for truth. We've got to know God for ourselves. And we're called to love God. Joshua said, love God with all your heart and soul. Jesus said that loving God is the greatest of the commandments of the whole Bible, and that loving our neighbors it comes in as a close second. Everything else hangs on those two. And loving God means worshiping God. It's getting up and singing praises to him. Loving God means serving God, getting involved in the mission of the church, showing up to schlep boxes at the food pantry, looking for ways to welcome refugees, serving in a homeless shelter. But at its root, loving God is just like what it sounds. It's love. It's something that happens in our hearts. It's a longing for God. It's a thirsting for God. It's a hunger for God. We can experience love of God in moments of intense worship where you pour your whole heart into singing, or you have this encounter with God's Spirit, or you hear a word that is just for you, or you share the broken bread and the cup poured out at his table. Or we can experience love of God in situations of awe. I am a sucker for awe. I mean, sunsets and dragonflies strewn across the Kansas sky, that will bring me to my knees every time. But love for God is more than that. It's also about this lingering drive within us. Paul said the love of Christ urges us on, and part of what he meant was that the love of God was what got him up in the morning and flung him out into the world to talk about with Jesus with people who sometimes wanted to kill him. And when I think about what the love of God looks like, I think of Brother Lawrence, the 17th century French monk, and he was someone who faced a lot of struggles in his life. He was crippled, he had to use crutches, but Brother Lawrence is known for his deep love for God. And he wrote about how he was always striving to be in the presence of God. And he said that the love of God was so palpable to him, so real to him, that he couldn't even just stoop over and pick up a straw from the ground, but for the love of God. You know, he's a saint, but I've met people who have that great love for God. Scruffy old souls whose hearts have found their way home. It's why I like to be part of this church. And one of the ways that I always see love for God made manifest is through love for others. And I think love for others is one of the hallmarks of love for God. In the end, love is at the heart of it. Without love for God, nothing else is possible. Why am I here? There's a lot of answers we could give. Life's variables played out 10,000 ways. But there's one answer that undergirds all the others. You're here because God has brought you into the world in love. And through everything that you are and do, God is calling you into a loving walk with him. Amen.